This is the Comics Alternative, episode 229, a Will Eisner Week special episode devoted to uses of the Spirit since 2005. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And this is our special 2017 Will Eisner Week episode where Andy and I are going to talk about representations of the Spirit after Will Eisner's death in January of 2005. But before we get into that fun conversation, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover. But often, you can find discounts that are more impressive than that.
That's right. And right now, DCB Service is helping to celebrate the centennial of Will Eisner's birth, with a bunch of stuff from Will Eisner, either offering again some of his classic works like the Spirit Archives and Last Days in Vietnam and so on, and some of the more recent stuff like The Spirit Returns by Matt Wagner and Dan Schady, and then and a bunch of T-shirts too. Some with Will Eisner's signature, some with the Centennial logo on them. So you can go to DCB Service and check all those out.
That's right. You get all of your Will Eisner-related material, Spirit and otherwise, through Discount Comic Book Service at great prices. Check out their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your Will Eisner stuff there and you're ready to celebrate Will Eisner Week, please send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
That's right.
You know, Andy, for the past several years, you and I have tried to do something special for Will Eisner Week. I know that we've had people on for interviews at various times. But this year we decided to do something a little different. We thought that we would use our Will Eisner Week episode to look at material that, if not specifically created by Will Eisner himself, then definitely inspired by Will Eisner. And that is uses of the Spirit since 2005.
Yeah, that's right. And because this is the centennial anniversary of Eisner's birth, I think it seems like some of these that the Spirit is gonna have a bit of a comeback this year. Lots of properties coming out with that feature the Spirit in them, and continuing things that have been going on for a little while too.
Yeah, and when we discussed doing this episode, I didn't realize how much post-Eisner Spirit there was out there until I started to make a list of this, and it's like, oh my God, we've got our work cut out for us on this episode. So there are a lot of material there.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you count, for example, one of the places where we start, the DC stuff, when DC got the rights to the Spirit and Darwin Cook was the creative force behind those. If you count all the DC stuff, there was 32 issues of that series, and then 17 issues of another series that came with that first wave initiative. And if you throw in that Batman and Spirit special, that makes 50 issues right there.
Wow. Well, I mean, God, but that's, I'm getting tired just kind of setting this up. But let's go ahead and I guess jump into the material that we're going to be discussing.
Yeah. So, I assume, have you been following along with the Spirit stuff that comes out, that has come out since Will Eisner's passing?
Yeah. With one exception, and I know you told me about this and it just completely escaped me. And that is the very recent stuff, in the Dick Tracy strip.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So, just a brief mention of that then. So, Joe Staton and Mike Curtis are doing a Spirit and Dick Tracy crossover that's going on right now. It started right after Christmas. I think it's actually December 26th. So literally right after Christmas that the storyline started, and it's still going on. And basically, there is an auction to sell an immortality formula in Dick Tracy's city, and the Spirit and Commissioner Dolan come in to help out, kind of run security on it and kind of check things out to make sure things don't get out of hand. And so there's a kind of collision of Spirit villains, like Carrion, and Dick Tracy villains, who all kind of merge together pretty well because they're all grotesque, right?
Right.
And then what else? Well, but then also Dick Tracy, when Joe Staton and Mike Curtis have been doing Dick Tracy in recent years, and I recommend the strip highly. It's just nuts. Since they've taken over, there's stuff going on the moon. There's people that live on the moon. So, and I think Dick Tracy's got, a daughter-in-law or something that is from the moon people. So she has a good conversation with the Spirit about what it's like to go to the moon since the Spirit has been to the moon. And so there's a lot of little call outs to past Spirit stories that Eisner did. But also in the Dick Tracy strip over the last few years, they've also connected it with other strips. So, for example, one of the people bidding on the immortality formula is Daddy Warbucks. and then there's going to be some Terry and the Pirates. There's some Terry and the Pirates stuff going on in there too. So it's being billed as a Dick Tracy Spirit crossover, but really it's setting up a whole kind of comic strip universe that has already been established in that Dick Tracy series. But I think that Joe Staton and Mike Curtis are doing a great job with capturing the Spirit as well, and showing the ways in which playing the Spirit off of Dick Tracy really works.
Yeah. Well, one of the things you mentioned when we were doing the sponsor bit at the top of the show was that, this being the centennial of Will Eisner's birth, what we'll probably see is a lot more of this, right? In a variety of different comics, there may be crossovers or mentionings or allusions to the Spirit. Which makes sense. And, this Dick Tracy strip where you're, mentioning that it's becoming a crossover with a variety of other properties as well, is really interesting.
I would mention before we jump away from that, you don't have to have the Spirit comic or the Dick Tracy comic strip in your local paper in order to read it. You can go to gocomics.com
and read it online.
And read it online. So, again, I definitely recommend checking that out.
Yeah. Now we should be clear about the specific comics that we're going to be discussing, or what I guess we could consider fair game for us. Because some people may think, oh, well, you're going to talk about the New Adventure Spirit comics. Well, no, we're not, because we're specifically interested in the way that others have used the Spirit since Will Eisner's death on January 3rd of 2005. And the new adventures, were going on before Will Eisner died. So basically the very first, as far as I know, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the very first use of the Spirit, in other words, someone else writing the Spirit after Will Eisner passed, was when Jeff Loeb and Darwin Cook did that Batman Spirit one-shot, which had a cover date of January 2007, but I guess we can say it came out in late 2006, which leads me to wonder if something like that was in the works before Will Eisner passed, or if Eisner's death kind of instigated that collaboration between Loeb and Cook.
Darwin Cook had said in interviews at that time that he had gotten Will Eisner's blessing to do the series before he had passed. And in fact, they were shocked by his passing. And I don't know if Eisner was going to get involved in the series or not, but he definitely knew about it and was giving Darwin Cook the freedom to do what he wanted with it.
Yeah. So, Darwin Cook, even outside of that Batman Spirit one shot, did a lot of that initial Spirit, those comics for DC, but a variety of other people have done the Spirit since then. Sergio Aragonés, Mark Evanier. And then when we get to the first wave stuff, we have Brian Azzarello. Later on, we get Mark Schultz, David Hein. And then when we get into the Rocketeer Spirit stuff from IDW, Mark Waid and company do that. And then most recently, the Dynamite stuff with Mark Wagner, David Schcadi, and then just recently the first issue came out, I think in February. Will Eisner's The Spirit, The Corpse Makers, the first issue came out, Francesco Francavilla. And then there's the Dick Tracy stuff. So a lot of different people are trying their hands at the Spirit. And one of the things you and I can discuss on this episode is how we feel that these various creators, both the writers and the artist, capture the spirit of the Spirit.
Yeah, that's a good place to start. Because one of the things in kind of looking through, and I scanned through some of the earlier stuff and reread the most recent stuff, that I kind of judge anybody working on the Spirit today is how much do they capture kind of the tone of Eisner's comics, or the style, or the types of narratives. In other words, if you took the story and you pulled the Spirit out and put somebody else in, like Batman or some other crime fighter, would that character fit in the story? And if so, then that's a less successful Spirit story than one in which you really get a sense that only this is a story that only would fit the Spirit.
Right. And depending on who the creators are or what series that we're looking at, I mean, there's some of these representations that do strike me as very Eisner-esque and capture that, let's say, original or early spirit of the Spirit. Okay, I'll stop saying the spirit of the Spirit. That tone, that feel of what Eisner did with the original Spirit. And then other times the creators take it in a very different direction. And I think those can potentially be successful. Sometimes those attempts resonated with me and other times they didn't. So I don't think that a successful Spirit is necessarily one that harkens back to Eisner's Spirit. I think that if a creator or a creative team takes the character, the Spirit, and the setting, the various characters and all that, Central City, and can make it into something quite different, but still really engaging and enjoyable, I would still consider that successful.
Yeah, I see what you're saying there. I find, for example, kind of jumping around through this, for example, the stuff that came out as part of the first wave, that 17 issue Spirit series, aside from the black and white backups, which I think are a different thing to comment on, the stuff that Mark Schultz first did and then David Hine, that stuff doesn't stand out to me because they're just kind of straightforward crime stories.
Right.
It stands out to me in that what they do with the Spirit, like, have Ebony be a female character.
Right.
That's different. But those stories seem to be pretty straightforward crime stories. When you look at, for example, the most recent stuff that Matt Wagner and Dan Schady did, that you've got an artist, first of all, who has that kind of, I don't want to say, I don't mean this as pejorative, cartoony style that kind of captures the fun and dynamic nature of the Spirit. And then you have Matt Wagner both using characters that are, especially Spirit's Rogues Gallery, bringing a lot of them back, and then adding characters that completely and totally fit into the Spirit's Rogues Gallery very easily.
Right.
And so I think the Matt Wagner stuff is the stuff I would rather see of the Spirit than just a kind of good crime story.
Right. And, one of the things that is, I guess, that stands out with the Wagner-Schady series, the original 12 issues that came out between 2015, 2016, and the collection came out late last year, in fact, is that, there is the milieu, obviously, the main characters. There's some new characters. I really love the introduction of, at least initially, this Kaiser Sose type of character or situation that we have. There's the humor. And I agree with you, not in a pejorative way, the cartoony style of Schady that I think works really well with this series. But where it stands out is that this is one long story and not a series of short done-in-ones that are nonetheless linked in a connective way. And in fact, that's one of the things that Wagner points out in his introduction to this collection, is that he wanted to try his hand at the Spirit, but to give it a different spin by creating a long story, something more novelistic, as opposed to a series of interconnected short stories. And I think it turned out really well.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I agree. I do think it turned out really well too. And I think Wagner wrote enough he wrote enough kind of iconic scenes that harken back to earlier Spirit stories, so that some of this may be attributed to Schady too, just choosing to use layouts or images that harken back to the earlier stories. But I feel like it's at once moving the Spirit character forward, but also being respectful and nostalgic about the past.
Right. And that leads me to wonder if maybe Dynamite now is doing more for the Spirit than DC ended up doing. And I think that when DC started its stuff back in late 2006, and especially with that first run of 32 issues, the one that started off with the first 12 issues, or at least 11 of those first 12 issues that Darwin Cook did. I think that they were doing what we find Mac Wagner and Schady have done. Great stories, capturing the original Spirit, the tone of Eisner's Spirit. Because the DC comics kind of changed after a while. And I don't want to necessarily say not for the better, but it was just different. Now, we were talking about some of the essential qualities of Eisner's Spirit. One of the things that I think a Spirit story absolutely has to have in capturing the tone of the original is humor. Both the visual humor of the art and also the humor in the writing itself. not that it can't be a good story without the humor, but without the humor, it's just not the Spirit the way that Eisner envisioned the Spirit. And again, it can still be a good story. Case in point, when we get to the first wave stuff, there's really no humor there at all.
Right.
We have the initial first wave miniseries, the 6 issues that Brian Azzarello and Rags Morales did. That wasn't just a Spirit story, because it includes a lot of other pulp heroes, right? Or a lot of other, there's Doc Savage, there's an early Batman, the Avenger, there's the Blackhawks, among others. And so he's part of that mix. I think that if you're a big Doc Savage fan, you're going to like those 6 issues of Azzarello's first wave. If you're not a Doc Savage fan, I don't know if you'll leave that series with much, because I think you have to be a little knowledgeable of Doc Savage, especially. You don't necessarily have to know the backstory of the Avenger or the Blackhawks or others, but I think you really do need to know Doc Savage world in order to really appreciate that first wave, those 6 issues that Azzarello did. And the same thing was the Spirit. I think you could take the Spirit out of Azzarello's first wave and you wouldn't be missing a whole lot, just as you could take the Avenger out and you wouldn't be missing a whole lot. You could take Rima the Jungle Girl out. You wouldn't be missing a whole lot. So I don't think that the Spirit, even though a significant part, is an essential part of Azzarello's first wave. But then there's that 17-issue run that started in June of 2010 that, Schultz and then later Hine did, the Spirit first wave. That's a very different Spirit. There's nothing humorous about it. It's dark. And in fact, the Dolan himself is seen as a much less sympathetic character. And you've already mentioned the female Ebony. I think a female Ebony works well, and I don't have a problem with a straight crime, even noir Spirit with this first wave stuff, those 17 issues. But it's just different. I think they're enjoyable on their own terms, but it's definitely not the kind of Spirit that we see, let's say, in Darwin Cook's work.
Yeah.
Or Wagner and Skady.
Yeah, there's a couple things I wanted to get back to with that first wave stuff. I think overall for me, as a fan of almost everything that the first wave was bringing back, I was really disappointed with how that ended up working out.
You talking about Azzarello's first wave?
Yeah. That series itself, is kind of plagued by delays. So, they had released the Doc Savage series and the Spirit series, which were supposed to come out after I think the first wave miniseries was done, before it was done. So you really didn't get a sense of how Azzarello was kind of laying out those characters before jumping into their own solo comics. There were mysteries that were laid out in that series, like with the Blackhawks, there was, there was some mysterious figure who was kind of running the Blackhawks from behind the scenes. That stuff never got developed. So you had the Doc Savage series, which had the Avenger as a backup, and it was a modern day update of the Avenger. And then you had the Spirit series with Spirit stories backing it up. And I remember being at HeroesCon one year and talking to Cliff Chang, and Cliff Chang said to me, you're going to be happy I'm doing one of the first wave books. And I said, oh, which one are you doing? Are you going to be doing Blackhawk? And he says, I can't tell you. And I said, you're doing Blackhawk, right? so anyway, and so that never happened either. So it was clear that first wave, there was a kind of big plan to turn that into a kind of, boutique imprint or whatever within DC. That was going to be kind of show run by Brian Azzarello that, just never went anywhere.
Yeah. So outside of those first 6 issues, that the first wave initial miniseries, the only ones we got out of that were Doc Savage and Spirit, right?
Right. And then the Avenger, because the Avenger backup story then also didn't finish when Doc Savage got canceled, and so they released a first wave special one shot that was meant to finish off that series. And in there, the first wave version of Batman also showed up. But yeah, I mean, so there was really, I think, a lot of potential there and a lot of lost potential.
Yeah.
It was also weird that they got Doc Savage and the Avenger, but they never got the Shadow.
Yeah.
And the story I heard was that they tried. And Brian Azzarello really wanted the Shadow in there. And that maybe the reason why Batman was in there was because they couldn't get the Shadow.
Yeah. Yeah, Batman does kind of stand out in that initial 6 issue of First Wave. But, one thing, though, you can say about getting back to the Spirit, the way that Azzarello wrote the Spirit in that 6-issue miniseries, there was a lighter tone with the Spirit there than you get in Schultz and then later Heinz's Spirit from the First Wave.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that Azzarello picked up on that others have done too with the Spirit is that one of the key characteristics of the Spirit is that he takes an enormous amount of punishment. And he's just a regular guy who can basically take a punch a lot and gets beat up, gets hit over the head, gets his clothes ripped off of him. And so I think Azzarello really kind of nailed the idea of a guy who goes out and fights crime and, is barely superior to the guys he's fighting.
Right. But so what are your thoughts on those 17 issues of the Spirit First Wave? I mean, that's definitely a darker, much more serious, nothing light or humorous representation of the Spirit. Did you not like that series?
No, I didn't care for it that much. But one of the points you made, I thought was a good one, that it's more of a noirish Spirit, and that can still work.
Yeah.
There's Eisner was doing a lot of noir stuff too. I mean, he was heavily influenced by film noir and his style. So, that is still consistent.
Yeah.
And not all of Eisner's Spirit stories are funny either. Sure. But I do agree with you too, that humor is a pretty important quality.
Yeah.
One of the other things I would add too is that being kind of visually experimental or creative is also an important quality. And that's something I didn't feel like I got out of that.
Yeah. The one thing that stands out to me about that First Wave stuff is the decision to make Ebony female. I think it worked well enough. I think it was I guess, relatively speaking, a bold move, and it was handled, I think, deftly. So why not? So, I mean, that's, I think, one of the things I appreciate most about that First Wave Spirit. And it strikes me that if we look at, let's say, Schultz and Heinz's Spirit in that First Wave as the most serious, the most noir Spirit, then on the other end of the spectrum, the most, and I don't mean this in a negative way, the most goofy Spirit, I think, is Mark Waid and the various artists he worked with, Paul Smith, Wallace and Wiesek, and then Jay Bone, that Rocketeer Spirit crossover, Pulp Friction. I mean, that strikes me as the wackiest collaboration. And I mean, it worked well enough. And I remember that you and I, a few years ago, we discussed that. I think because we were doing a Rocketeer episode, if you remember. Yeah. And that first issue of the Rocketeer Spirit crossover from IDW had just recently been released. And so we discussed that first issue. So we've talked about that before. That gets kind of, goofy in places, but in a fun way. And, but again, I'm okay with that.
Yeah. That's interesting that you mention it, because I think one of the things we see in looking at all of this stuff together is that there are lines that can get crossed with the spirit that are subtle and can push it into something that doesn't work that well. And when you said goofy, the thing I automatically thought of was that 11 or 12 issue run that Sergio Aragonis and Mark Evanier wrote, where each issue is its own story, own self-contained story. They have a lot of different artists. Paul Smith is one of them. And I think they find artists that I think do a really good job. I think Paul Smith is one of the best post Eisner Spirit artists because he can capture a certain quality of Eisner style while still keeping it his own. I think Mike Plug, who does some of that stuff and who actually worked under Eisner.
Oh yeah, he apprenticed with Eisner. Yeah, so that makes sense.
Is a good example in those, but he doesn't do very much. He only does a couple issues. But those are just kind of corny. And so they've got humor in them. But the thing that I always wish they did more of in those stories was to use the Spirit's rogues gallery more, or the femme fatales that the Spirit has famously dealt with. None of those really come up very much in that run, and that was I think disappointing to me.
Yeah, I think that Darwin Cook, those 11 issues that he did, he used the rogues gallery more than the others. And, you're right in terms of Aragones and Evanier's writing and the corniness. Yeah, there were moments in going back and rereading those issues that I just rolled my eyes. And I may have sighed out loud. I don't know, because I didn't have anyone here with me as I was reading them to comment on my whatever sounds were coming from me as I was reading these issues again. But sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. They're fun stories, but they're nothing to stand out to me. Now Darwin Cook's do. And I think first and foremost because of the art. But I also think that he did a really good job with those 11 issues that he did. 12 if we include the Batman Spirit crossover, that one shot. But because each of the issues for that Spirit run, 1 through 12, and there was one of those within the first 12 that was an anthology collection, like a summer special that he didn't write. A lot of other people did the pieces. But of those 11 issues that he did, they each stand on their own. So they're self-contained stories, but the way that Cook wrote them is you can read all of those together in a cohesive manner. Yeah. Because there is a storyline threaded throughout, if not all, then the vast majority of those 11 issues, and that is the mystery behind Alvaro Mortes. Yeah. And I think that works really well to kind of string these individual stories that, again, stand on their own just nicely, but to string them all together into more of a collective whole. And I think, it's also maybe one of the reasons why of all the Spirit stories that we're looking at here, at least the ones the DC came out with, the only collections, the trades that have come out in hardcover editions were those first 2 volumes that, by and large, Darwin Cook did. Yeah, that's right. They did all of this. The whole series has been collected in paperback, but you're right; those were the only ones that were done in hardcover, and I think deservedly so. Right. But one of the things that I think Cook did, like in taking responsibility for the series and the property that he was given, is that he did a really good job of keeping Eisner's qualities of the Spirit while also updating the character and dealing with some of the problematic aspects of the Spirit. So, he didn't shy away from, for example, using ebony, but he updates ebony into a more modern role. Right. That isn't the stereotyped, blackface character that Eisner created. But I think
even more so, Cook did a better job with the female characters in the Spirit. I think it is. It's been a little bit since I've read this. Having, for example, Sans Serif,
who works for the FBI?
Yeah, in issue 4, actually rescuing the Spirit. And so you've got that great cover of issue 4 with her carrying the Spirit through the desert, which is the inverse of an actual Eisner cover that went the other way. And so making those female characters more updated and stronger and more independent, I thought was a great move on Cook's part.
Yeah. And, we've mentioned this a few times on the podcast before whenever we're talking about Darwin Cook. Not only in terms of his characterization, but maybe especially in terms of the art. No one does women like him. And so I think handling the women in the Spirit's life, the vast majority of whom are femme fatales, I think it just makes sense to have someone like a Darwin Cook represent them and to take them on and to bring out who these people are, not only in terms of their characters, but in terms of the way that we visualize them, or the way how he visualizes these women looking, given the characters and their relationship with Danny Coulter or the Spirit. So so he does it really well. Go ahead.
Sorry, I needed to correct myself. It was Silk Satin that I was thinking of, not Sans Serif.
Oh, okay, Silk Satin. That's right.
She works for the CIA.
That's right, the CIA. So we got the FBI in the name wrong, but other than that, we're right on. But yeah, and that, I think that's one of the reasons why of all of the Spirit, that those comics that have come out since Will Eisner's death in 2005, the ones that really stand out to me are the Darwin Cook comics. I would say maybe along with that would have to be the Wagner Schady more recent run, which I think is one of my favorites as well. But I'm just a big fan of Darwin Cook. And so when I think of, who can really handle the Spirit after Will Eisner, Darwin Cook, definitely.
Yeah. And, if you kind of imagine the monumental challenge it was to do that, to be given that responsibility, and also to know that people were going to be looking at it to see how he would deal with the more problematic aspects of Eisner's The Spirit. And then rather than just avoiding them, just leaving out Ebony or leaving out, some of the more misogynistic female characterizations, to instead, update them or even flip them. And was, I think, a really brilliant move on his part, and a gutsy move too. Right.
Yeah. Now, on the topic of Cook's run on the Spirit, the one, and I think this is very minor crack in the facade that he created, which is otherwise very beautiful. And I didn't realize this originally, but going back and rereading this stuff, I saw the crack is inconsistency with the name Alvaro Mortez. Because when we're first introduced to this character, and that's in the 3rd issue of Cook's run on the Spirit, it is spelled with an E, E-L-V-A-R-R-O, Mortez. But then later in the series, when we actually do see a reanimated Alvaro, it's Alvaro, A-L-V. So, and when I first noticed that, I thought, okay, I'm misremembering, because I was remembering in the earlier issues the name started with an E. And I went back to look at issue 3. Yep, the E's there. But again, a very minor crack.
Yeah, some editor dropped the ball there.
Yeah.
So I think that Darwin Cook's run has most of the qualities you need to do a successful Spirit series, in terms of both art and story. I think that going through kind of the rest of them, there are often ones that have that get the art right but don't get the story right, and then vice versa. And going back, I think, like, for example, the Paul Smith issues that he drew, and that Evanier and Aragonus wrote are ones in which they get the art right, and not so much the stories.
Yeah. Okay. You mentioned the artist and then Paul Smith. That reminds me of a question I wanted to ask you. Getting back to the Rocketeer Spirit Pulp Friction miniseries. I think that's a good story, and it does what it needed to do, what it set out to do, because these two characters, the Rocketeer and the Spirit, do come from a common temporal setting. Bringing the two together just makes perfect sense. And in fact, Mark Waid has even written about that. Yes, why not bring these two together? And I like that series well enough. The one thing about it, though, that bugged me a little bit was the art. And I think the art among the 4 issues, it was all good, but it wasn't consistent. Because for that first issue, Mark Waid worked with Paul Smith. And then on that second issue, he worked with Loston Wallace and Bob Wiacek. And then the last 2 issues, it was Jay Bone. And again, each of them, all the artists on their own, did a really good job. But for a miniseries of only 4 issues, I wondered about the reasoning behind bringing in different artists. In other words, why not have Paul Smith down for all 4 issues or Jay Bone for all 4 issues? And I'm sure that there are reasons. It's just that it was definitely noticeable in going back to reread this series that we had different artists here. And again, the art was fine, but whenever I went from one issue, or I guess in collected form from one chapter to the next, I was momentarily taken out of the story because I noticed the change in art. And sometimes the change is a little subtle. Sometimes it's more noticeable.
Yeah, I don't know what happened to Paul Smith in that series, but that is a thing that I feel like has often happened. I like Paul Smith as an artist, but there are several series in which he drew the first issue and then never drew another issue again. And I'm not sure what's going on there. But, Jay Bone did work with Cook on his Spirit. And so I thought he was a good choice, but you're right. I would have preferred that he had done the whole series.
Yeah. Now I do think that, Paul Smith's art has a more Eisner feel to it, but to me it has a more Plug feel to it, which Plug's art has a more Eisner feel. So if that makes sense. So I think the Paul Smith stuff really does work well in that first issue of Rocketeer Spirit Pulp Friction. But I like Jay Bone stuff too, but that is a much more cartoony kind of style, which when it comes right down to it, fits visually with the kind of story, the tone here. I said that this is probably the goofiest in a good way of what I think of as of all the Spirit stories we're discussing. And so I think Jay Bone's art really works well in that sense.
Yeah, I agree.
And that was, I guess, IDW's one foray into the Spirit, if we don't count, those massive artist editions, which we're not, in this discussion. But, yeah. And, I'm wondering, speaking of publishers, okay, so DC, and I guess DC still owns the rights, or I guess, well, the Eisner estate, but it's DC. I mean, okay. Let me ask. I mean, because I don't know. I started talking about this, and it just dawned on me. Hell, I don't know what I'm talking about. Do you know of the relationship between the Eisner estate and DC Comics now?
I'm not sure, because we had that 75th anniversary collection,
right?
A lot of the Spirit archives are still in print, not all of them, but that may just be because there are copies left, from the original print runs. So I don't know, other than that 75th anniversary book, I don't know of any other any more recent Spirit reprint projects or anything that DC's done. So Dynamite has the license for the Spirit. I don't know if that gives them then the opportunity to publish, to reprint old Spirit stuff, like the way that, for example, they've reprinted DC's Shadow series. So I don't know the answer to that question. Now Norton has taken DC had for a while the whole Will Eisner library, and now Norton has that, right?
Right. Yes. Norton does.
So I'm really not sure then what is left that DC actually has.
And the reason I'm wondering is because, we get in the most recent representations of the Spirit, again, discounting the Dick Tracy run, have been Dynamite stories, right? And then before that, we had that 4-issue miniseries at IDW with the Rocketeer. Mm-hmm. And so I'm just wondering about the politics of this and, what kind of agreements they have. In other words, why isn't DC the one who's coming out with, what we have now with Francesco Francavilla? Or why didn't we see, how did IDW, what kind of agreement did they have to pair him with the Rocketeer? I'd just be curious to know that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think with the IDW stuff, it's more like getting the temporary license the way they do with, like having, Green Lantern team up with Planet of the Apes or with Dark, co-publishing with Dark Horse. Because I think that IDW, if you look at the IDW series, it does say something about in conjunction with DC. Mm-hmm. So I think at that time that was at least the tail end of DC having the Spirit license. Now it seems like, Dynamite has that, and, they're doing, I don't know if they're going to try to do a regular series or they're just going to do a series of mini series like the two we've seen so far that allow different creators to kind of exercise their interest in doing a Spirit story. Right.
And, a lot of the stuff that IDW and Dynamite do, even outside the Spirit, obviously, is a lot of licensed stuff. So, it makes sense that they would do this. I didn't think about this until we just started to discuss this now, but we could have contacted, people who were associated with the Eisner estate, Danny Fingerroth, Carl and Nancy Groper, and asked them about some of the ins and outs of this. I didn't even think about that.
Well, that could be, that could be interesting to find out anyway. Mm-hmm. But what I wonder too with Dynamite is, how a lot of what Dynamite has done lately is have their characters that they license cross over. Mm-hmm. So the Shadow teams up with Green Hornet. We're having the Shadow and the Avenger and Doc Savage team up makes sense because they are all part of the same, they're all owned by Street and Smith. But I wonder if we'll see, a Spirit Green Hornet crossover, if that's allowed within the licensing agreements that they have.
Yeah. I hope not. And I'll tell you why, because I have nothing against crossovers, and especially crossovers, let's say, with vastly different properties, right? Like, recently we had Planet of the Apes and the Green Lanterns. Okay, fine. When it comes right down to it, if you're reading comics for just sheer enjoyment, just having a good time, then why not, right? If people are going to appreciate this, or they're going to enjoy reading those stories, then, have at it. I have nothing against that. It just doesn't work for me. I don't really get into those kind of crossovers. I think maybe the closest I've enjoyed something like that is when Star Trek The Next Generation and Doctor Who crossed over. And for me, that was more of a curiosity than anything. But other than that, it's just not my kind of story, right? So coming back to the Spirit, I hope they don't cross him over at least too outrageously. I think of the crossovers that we have and that we're discussing on this show, I think that the Batman Spirit crossover that Loeb and Cook did, okay, that was good. I think if you leave it at a one shot, no problem. I think that was a fun story, and I guess there's a reason why that recent centennial collection of the Spirit from DC included this, because again, it's kind of a fun recent story. And then the same thing with the Rocketeer. You know, it was short, it was sweet, it was funny, had a good time. I feel a little more mixed about the Azzarello first wave, as I've already mentioned, but I think that's about the only crossovers we have, and if we leave it at that, okay. I definitely don't want DC to try to work the Spirit into the DC universe. I think that Batman Spirit one shot, okay, I'll go there with you, but I don't want to go any further.
Yeah, I agree. I think the Spirit exists in his own world, and it's a unique world, stylistically and, in terms of the types of stories that are available. Yeah. And if you start trying to work him into other continuities, it becomes too difficult to manage, because there's even almost a kind of that the Spirit's world also has its own kind of physical rules, where the Spirit can take an enormous amount of punishment. And also things like, the story, like going back to the Eisner stuff, one of the greatest stories Eisner did was the story of Gerhard Schnabel. And the idea that this guy could fly that has to be taking place in a world in which that is a unique thing to happen. And so if you got, superheroes flying around, then Gerhard Schnabel's story doesn't have the impact that it has in the self-contained universe of the Spirit. So yeah, I think the Spirit needs for the most part to stay on his own, unless a property can be brought in that can adapt to the Spirit's world rather than vice versa.
Right. Yeah. And, that one shot we had that Loeb and Cook did, is good enough. But if you leave it at that, that's fine. Because if DC attempts any further integration of the Spirit into the DC universe, I mean, I would feel the same way as, them attempting, as they're doing, to force the world of the Watchmen into the DC universe. It just doesn't work for me. Now, mixing the Spirit with other characters, as we've seen, let's say the pulp stuff with Azzarello's first wave, I think it had potential. And the reason that miniseries didn't work for me is for reasons other than, the whole crossover thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So we've talked a lot about what doesn't work, and we've talked some about what works. Do you have any moments within these Spirit stories that we read that kind of stand out to you as feeling like moments where the creators just really nailed it?
I think that one of I may have already mentioned this. I think the Cook stuff definitely, for the most part, but one of the, I guess, more recent uses of the Spirit that really stands out to me is the aforementioned Wagner Schady 12-issue series. I think that they just did a great job. As you put it, they nailed it. They captured the characters. The one place where I wish they had gone further is to bring out more of his rogues gallery. I think that when in the first half of their Spirit, the Return of the Spirit, they start to do this, but then the way that the story progresses, it kind of it moves into a direction where if they begin introducing other characters within the Spirit universe, that it would detract from their story. And so I can see why they didn't do that. But at least the first half of their 12-issue run was them occasionally bringing in other figures. So, for instance, we did get Sans Serif, we did get Pagel, we did get Carrion, and so I was thinking, in the first half of that 12-issue series, that we would get more of this as everything progressed. We really didn't. I can understand why we didn't. Mm-hmm. Other than that, though, I think that they did an outstanding job. And for me, what they've done is to set a very high bar for Frank Avila's new project, which we really haven't talked that much about. And so at some point I want us to get to that first issue. But let me turn the question you asked me back on you. I mean, do you think that there is a use or representation of the Spirit where the creators as a team just really nailed it?
I want to come back to some of the things you said about the Wagner and Schady series in a minute, but out of all the stuff we've read, the one story that really stood out to me is one of the short stories that's in that first wave Spirit series. So as I mentioned before, you had backup stories that were black and white Spirit stories done by different creators, and you had some pretty high level creators. Mm-hmm. You had Harlan Ellison and Kyle Baker did a story together, Denny O'Neil and Bill Sienkiewicz. And so on. And this final issue of that series seems to be, getting rid of the backlog of those short stories that they had and putting them all in one issue. So you have three separate short stories, one by Howard Chaykin and Brian Bolin, one by Paul Levitz and Jose Luis Garcia Lopez, and one by Will Pfeiffer and P. Craig Russell. And one of the things that surprised me about that issue was that the Chaykin Boland and the Levitz Garcia Lopez stories aren't that great. We don't get to see Brian Boland's sequential art very much anymore, and so it's unfortunate when it's in the service of a not so good story. And I think the Garcia Lopez story looks great. I don't think. It's a decent story. I think it's just a pretty good Spirit story, but not much more than that. I think what Will Pfeiffer and P. Craig Russell did with their short story which is called Art Walk, is one of the few instances of creators just absolutely capturing the playfulness and the experimental nature of Eisner's work. And just to kind of briefly summarize this really short story. So there's two janitors who are working in an art museum, and one of them is going through and kind of pontificating on the history of art in each room that they go through. And meanwhile, the Spirit is trying to stop a group of thieves who are robbing the museum. And in each case, when the janitors are describing a certain art style or work of art, the Spirit in his fight is actually kind of duplicating that style. So for example, when they're getting to this is an unreal. First of all, this is an unreal museum because it has the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in it. But when he's talking about that work, the Spirit kind of jumps down from the air. When they get to, for example, Duchamp's nude descending a staircase, the Spirit and the thug he's fighting with are rolling down a staircase in a similar style. The Spirit gets hit over the head with Duchamp's fountain, the urinal that he signed, and so on. So there's all these little like visual gags that run throughout that story, and it's just just kind of a perfect nugget capturing the spirit, and the kind of playfulness and experimentalism that Eisner would very often have in his short stories. Yeah. So if I could pick one story that I really, really wish others would have done more with, more kind of stories like it, that's one that I would pick.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that for a couple of reasons. One, what you mentioned, the experimental nature of the storytelling, which, we got a lot, obviously, with Eisner. But another thing about the spirit stories that Eisner did that I think the vast, vast, vast majority of more current writers and artists of spirit have not done, again, with the exception that you just pointed out, is that not every spirit story has to be so overtly focused on the spirit. And in fact, some of the most memorable ones are ones where the spirit may have been in the background, right? Yeah. And so that's one of the things that's missing from, the later, let's say post 2005 representations of the spirit, is that if it's a spirit story, obviously it has to be about the spirit, which in many ways makes sense. But part of the beauty of Eisner's The Spirit is that not every spirit story had to have the character, the spirit, as front and center.
That I'm glad you mentioned that, because that brings up for me something I wanted to say about the Wagner and Schady series, which is that that story starts out, and as we talked about when we looked at just the first issue of it, with the spirit has been gone from Central City for 2 years.
Right.
And so the very first spirit story, the first issue, doesn't have the spirit in it except in flashback. And then the next couple issues deal with Ebony and Sammy, Spirit's past partners, who are now their own detective agency. Ebony White and Matt Wagner gives Sammy, who's previously didn't have a last name Strunk, so that they could be Strunk and White, which is a cute joke. And they can't understand why people keep calling them and asking them grammar questions. But that having the spirit gone for a couple of years and not in those first couple issues except in flashback, I thought was an interesting move, because that also allowed Wagner and Schady to bring in some of the rogues gallery and some of the femme fatales. So when Ebony and Sammy were doing their investigation, they'd go to these different people, whether it's Pagel or Carrion. But I'm really glad that they pulled the trigger on bringing Spirit back quickly. That they don't let that kind of where is the spirit thing linger. But the idea that the spirit's been held prisoner on an island for a couple years, I thought also really worked within kind of the way, and it had a feeling of Eisner's work as well. And so I think that was a good mechanism, because the spirit, a lot of the Eisner spirit stories have him go to other countries. He doesn't stay in Central City the whole time. He is often, in fact, stranded on deserted islands. Mm-hmm. And so using that setting of this, prison on a deserted island was I thought a really good move on Wagner's part in particular. And so I think that series worked really well on all those levels. And so I agree, if you were kind of taking, I gave the example of just like kind of one short story that really nails it. But I think if you're looking for kind of consistently doing the spirit well, then the Cook stuff and the Wagner and Schady stuff is the stuff that does it the best, most consistently.
Yeah. And another thing I really enjoy about Wagner and Schady's Spirit is that not only do, especially, early in their run, do they revisit some of the older Spirit characters, but they bring in new characters, but these new characters could have fit seamlessly into Eisner's world that he created. And the best example of that is the femme fatale we get in this series, which is Sachet Spice.
Yeah, Sachet Spice and her father, Mikado Voss.
Yeah, he's the Kaiser Sose kind of character.
Right, a bad guy who is so bad that even the octopus is scared of him. So, Octopus previously being the mastermind behind the crime in Central City, flees when the Spirit brings up Mikado Voss.
Yeah. Okay. And I don't want to go into too much detail about Mikado Voss because I think if our listeners have not read Wagner and Skady's run, then it may be a tad of a spoiler when you first see him. But I think the one thing about their Spirit that had me scratching my head a little bit was the revelation of Voss, especially knowing what we know about Sachet Spice. And I'm thinking, this is her father? Genetically, it doesn't seem to make sense, but
that's interesting that you say that, because in the back of the collection, there are sketches of different versions of that character that Skady drew. And in looking at those sketches, there's some there that I would have rather have picked.
Right. Yeah, I noticed the same.
Than the final version that they end up using.
You're talking about Voss, right?
Yeah, and so I thought that was a really interesting inclusion there because they're so vastly different. Mm-hmm. Some of these versions, it isn't just like what you often see in a sketchbook, which is, what the final version is, and all the previous versions are just little tweaks on what ends up being the final version.
Right.
These are dramatically different.
Right. Now, again, I don't want to give anything away here. I understand where Wagner and Skady were going in choosing the Voss that they chose, because that works well with the historical context of this story. However, again, genetically, it doesn't make as much sense. But I do think that the Voss character, but especially Sachet Spice, would fit perfectly into Eisner's Spirit world. I mean, Sachet Spice, again, another one of these names that, a kind of alliterative femme fatale.
Yeah.
And also, she, like all the others, quite attractive, very striking. And, another thing I liked, speaking of female characters that Wagner and Skady did, was they did add more depth to, Ellen. And I appreciate that. I mean, and they made her not only, let's say, more than a starstruck or a pining female figure, but they gave her a job. They actually gave her a significant occupation that is a central part of the story that they're telling.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'm glad you mentioned that. Yeah, having her, first of all, having moved on from the Spirit after he's disappeared, but also that she has an important role in Central City politics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I couldn't help but, let's say, counterbalance Wagner and Skady's use of Ellen in their Dynamite run with, and I can't remember what issue it is, like 21, 22, 23 of DC Spirit. This is where Aragonés and Evanier were the writers. And it's that story, again, I can't remember what issue number, but it's the story where Ellen joins up with a biker gang. They're going to take her back. You know which one I'm talking about?
Yeah. I thought you were going to go with the one where she's on a cruise, but okay.
Well, there's that one, but I think the one that I'm thinking about, and the reason I'm bringing this up is a more egregious use of her as a physical object. Right?
Yeah.
Because she's originally, isn't she with her volleyball team? I think.
Yeah.
And so, of course, you have a lot of very shapely, very attractive women who are scantily clad, even Ellen. And so when we see her a very attractive figure. But that's the only reason she's in that story for the most part, is primarily as eye candy. Definitely not the case with the Ellen that we see from Wagner and especially Skady. I think that they do a fantastic job of fleshing her out and not in an objectifying way.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And, I think that's one of the biggest problems I had with the Aragonés Evanier run, is that they make Ellen more like the way she was in many of the Eisner stories, where she's so kind of love struck with the Spirit, and yet she's frustrated when he rebuffs her, and so she goes and intentionally does something stupid in order to make him jealous.
Right.
Or that, that she's constantly, again, just kind of trying to make the Spirit jealous about her, her other romantic forays and stuff like that. And the one where she and her girlfriends go on this singles cruise and the Spirit ends up on it too, is another good example of that sort of thing. I'd rather see Ellen, especially in the 21st century, be like she is in the most recent stories, even though, again, those are taking place in 1946, but that, we don't need that earlier version of Ellen anymore.
Right. And, this gets back to something that I said earlier. I think that Wagner and Skady set a very, very high bar on the Spirit that Francavilla now is having to deal with. And we only have this first issue of the Spirit, the Corpse Makers, that is out. And so we really don't have much to work on. But I get the sense that from this first issue that Francavilla is going in a very different direction. And in fact, this is the kind of Spirit that we see in Schultz and Heinz's run on the first wave stuff that they did, in that we have a much more serious, it seems to me from this first issue, we're going to see a more serious noir kind of story being told here that is quite a bit different from what Wagner was doing.
Yeah, that's interesting that you describe it that way. I think definitely, Francavilla's art, first of all, with its heavy inks, lends itself to noir very easily. But also, he's doing some really interesting things with panel designs and page layouts. Even a simple scene like very early on when Spirit and Dolan are talking in the car. And you get these interestingly arranged or interestingly designed panels, but basically the same shot through the windshield of the car in the rain. And then the Spirit jumps from there to Ebony's taxi, and we get another two panels in that same format. I like the way Francavilla designed those two pages, and I think that is definitely in keeping with the way Eisner would have done something like that.
Right. And also it's appropriate that this story starts out with a lot of rain, so we have the Eisner spritz.
Exactly. Exactly. But go ahead.
No. I think that is definitely I was going to say just a very conscious tip of the pen to Eisner there. Really appropriate.
Absolutely. And I think so far, and again, like you said, we've only got one issue. This one issue, I think it stands out to me for the art. I feel like the story itself hasn't stood out enough yet. And in fact, there's a lot of things in the story that just seem like the sorts of things we've seen before. For example, we're introduced to a cousin of Ebony's who's got a criminal record, and he wants to get out of the crime business, but his former boss drags him back in and blackmails him, threatening that he'll kill Ebony if he doesn't participate in this bank robbery. I mean, we've seen that sort of thing many, many times before in movies and comics of this sort, and so as I was reading it, I was kind of wished that the story itself had raised itself up to another the level of the art. And maybe that will happen. I mean, we've got 4 issues left of this series.
So this is going to be a 5-issue series?
Yeah.
Okay.
But right now that first issue was kind of underwhelming in terms of story, but really impressive in terms of the art.
Yeah, I feel exactly the same. In my experience in reading this, I was bowled over by Francovilla's art. And it was what I was expecting. So yeah. That's really good. In the story, when I read this first issue, and then got to the very last page of story, I was literally surprised. I thought, wait a minute now. This is not even 20 pages. And then I went back and counted the number of pages we got in the story. And yeah, this is a full issue. It just doesn't feel like a full issue. I think this is a good setup, but I didn't feel that there's enough of the story that has me really hooked, unlike the art, which, from, the first pages, right, with, the Eisner spritz, I think it really, really got me. And I'm wondering if something like this may be better in trade than in single issue. And one of the good things about Wagner and Schkede's story is I think it did read well in single issue.
Yes.
And it reads even better, I think, or at least just as good, if not better, collected. But that was a 12-issue run. This is only 5. And so I would think that the need to really capture the reader in individual issues would be greater with this Francavilla run. But this first issue, in terms of the story, I don't know. I wanted there to be more. It ended much too soon for me, even though, it's a full, 22, 21 pages, something like that.
Yeah. That's interesting because I had a similar reaction at the end where I thought this is done, because it's not that it felt short to me, but it felt like the ending really wasn't much of a cliffhanger, or wasn't as kind of dramatically a cliffhanger as it should be. So, but then again, I often feel that way with Dynamite's books for some reason. Part of which is because they load up so many like ad pages and other things in the back that you've still got 10 pages of the magazine left when the story ends, and I keep thinking, oh, there's got to be more to this than that, because I can feel a whole bunch of pages still coming up. But I guess that's just the way they do it. And that's maybe just me kind of being cued to a certain kind of reading experience where, usually the second to last page of the comic is the last page of the story. And then you get a letter page or two and then the back cover.
Right. Now, you mentioned earlier, you were wondering if maybe this is going to be an ongoing thing with Dynamite, in that we're going to get these individual runs or volumes of Spirit done by different creators or creative teams. And I was looking back at the publication information page of this Francavilla first issue, and on the copyright information, it says Will Eisner's The Spirit, Corpse Makers, Volume 2, Number 1. So they're, at least officially, calling this a Volume 2 with the Wagner and Schkede as the first volume. So if there's a Volume 1 and then a Volume 2, I would assume that there probably is going to be a Volume 3, because why indicate this as a Volume 2 if this wasn't something that they had maybe long-term plans for?
Right. That's a really good point. And I'm glad in that sense that so far anyway, Dynamite's only doing one series at a time, as opposed to what they've done in the past, for example, with Green Hornet having sometimes 5 or 6 series going at once, but also even what they're doing now with James Bond, which I like. I think everything they're doing with James Bond has been great so far. But, currently I'm reading 3 different James Bond comics. And I would rather have seen at least one at a time.
Mm-hmm. And also on this publication copyright page, you have an image of Eisner that is part of, I guess, the Eisner Centennial. This is Eisner Centennial logo, or a Eisner Centennial logo. And this is something that we didn't see in the earlier Dynamite Spirit. And if this is going to be a 5-issue series, and I'm guessing this will come out monthly and not every other month. If that's the case, if maybe the second half of 2017, we'll see the third volume of the Spirit. And I'm wondering who's going to be doing that.
Yeah, one would hope in the latest solicitations that we've received, this series is on issue 4, so there'll be one more issue to go, and then we'll see if the following month, or maybe 2 months later, we'll get another one. I would like to see it. What I would really love to see is Matt Wagner writing and drawing a Spirit story.
Oh yeah. Yeah. But I wonder, since Wagner did that, the return of the Spirit,
right,
if, now he would, they're going to have a series of different creators to see how they handle things.
Yeah, maybe.
So I don't know. And another thing about the Dynamite series that I hope they do with Franco Villa and then subsequent ones, if they do go that route, is to put these out in nice hardbound editions. Cause I mentioned earlier that the Darwin Cook stuff were collected in 2 really nice hardcover volumes and then later in paperback trades. But, I like the hardcover. It adds prestige and literally heft, to the Spirit that we get here. And, just late last year, the Wagner Schady collected edition came out in a nice hardcover. And so if we have the same with the Franco Villa and then subsequent volumes, that's going to be great for libraries.
Yeah, that's a good point. Another thing we haven't mentioned, and I think goes along with people I'd like to see doing upcoming Spirit stories, is that for most of the covers for most of that Matt Wagner, Dan Schady series, Eric Powell did them. And Eric Powell draws a great Spirit. I mean, he's already also working in an Eisner style.
Right.
Anyway. So an Eric Powell Spirit story.
I would love that. In fact, when you're right. All those covers that he did for that first volume from Dynamite were just outstanding. And you can maybe even look, I think you can read The Goon as an over-the-top Spirit with horror.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that would be great to have him illustrating a Spirit story, not just the covers.
Yes. So, so I think there's, great. I mean, I think Francesco Francavilla would be one of the people I would would have loved to see do the Spirit. So I'm really glad to see him, doing this story. And again, I'm sticking with this series to the end. So I'm really hoping to see this, see what happens here, and hoping the story improves and the art continues to be outstanding.
Well, wow, we have covered a lot of ground on this special Will Eisner Week episode. As I pointed out at the top of the show, there's a lot more post-Eisner Spirit than one would initially think.
Yeah, and we managed to get through this without once talking about that piece of shit movie. Oops, I brought it up.
Oh, it's funny that you mentioned this, because last week I, emailed Carl Nancy Groper and then Danny Fingeroth to let them know I mean, they knew already because they've included the comics alternative and publicity material. But I just wanted to give them a heads up. It's like, yes, on the 1st of March, the very beginning of Will Eisner week, which is always the first week of March, that we're going to be doing this episode. And Carl emailed me back saying, thanks for the reminder. Look forward to listening to it. And he mentioned something about the movie. And when I responded to him, I said, yeah, we're only dealing with the comics. So we're not dealing with anything cinematic, but even if we did want to bring in other media, I definitely would want to talk about the film. That was such a disappointment.
Yeah. And what made it, I mean, I don't want to get off on the film too much, but what made it a bigger disappointment to me is that it came out on my birthday. And at that time, I used to get to go to see a movie on my birthday. Like that would be like, I mean, get to go. I mean, I was in my 40s, but I need to get permission. But that, in lieu of having a birthday party, I just want to go to a movie. And so when that was coming out on my birthday, I was so excited. And then we went to it, and I felt so bad that I had subjected my wife to that movie that I've never done a birthday movie since.
Wow, they ruined you.
Yeah, so Spirit ruined. It wasn't just that it's a terrible movie, but it ruined my birthday.
Wow. See, that you mentioned, how you went to the movie with your wife, Jen. I saw it. We didn't see it in the theater, but we saw it on, I don't know, DVD, I guess. When it was released, my wife, Amanda, and I saw that. And I think this was her first real exposure to the Spirit. And after the film ended, she, from what I remember, she turned to me and said, "You wanted me to see that?" I apologized the rest of the night. Yeah. I am so sorry. I am so sorry.
Yep.
But we don't want to end on a downbeat note. A lot of good comics that we discussed, and a lot of this Spirit stuff you can definitely get at the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. So, hey, right now, head on over to dcbservice.com and there do a search for Spirit, Will Eisner. You will find a slew of books and other material that's Eisner-related. That's dcbservice.com. Go there for all of your Eisner-related needs. And after you do get your stuff there, get in touch with us and let us know what you think about our Will Eisner Week 2017 special episode of the Comics Alternative. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or if you want to be old school about it, pick up the phone and dial 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
That's right, or you can get a hold of us by email. We are two guys at comicsalternative.com, or you can get a hold of us individually. I'm Andy at comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com.
And we also have our Twitter feed, which you can check out at the number 2 guys with PhDs.
That's right. You can also find us on Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, which is, again, comicsalternative.com.
That's right. All the ways to get a hold of us and let us know how we're doing and find out what we're doing.
That's right. And we had a really good time going through all of this post-2005 Spirit stuff. But next week we will be back with the March Previews catalog episode. So look forward to that. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy. See ya.